If you believe that sometimes the quietest among us are the most courageous, don't forget to like and subscribe. The room was filled with the kind of hushed murmurs you only hear in places where people have time to form opinions on others. An air of skepticism hung over the medal ceremony, clouding the atmosphere like a thick fog. Sergeant Emily Harper stood near the back, away from the spotlight, her hands folded neatly behind her back. She was young, too young, in the eyes of most, and her presence there seemed almost misplaced. The whispers began as soon as she entered, barely audible over the hum of the crowd, but their weight was impossible to ignore. "She doesn't belong here," someone said. "Why is she even here?" Another voice followed, tinged with judgment. "Barely out of training, and now she's being awarded a medal. They must be desperate." Emily's face remained still, an impassive mask that betrayed none of the frustration she must have felt. She had heard these comments before, from colleagues, from officers, from strangers. But there was something different this time. This time, the whispers weren't just whispers. They were loud enough to carry, loud enough to question her presence, to make her doubt herself. She stood there, quiet, waiting her turn, the distant sound of people's voices reflecting off the cold walls of the hall. She had heard it all, so much so that her heart had stopped reacting. Every glance, every dismissive look, every "she doesn't belong here" had become a part of her daily routine. Yet here she was, standing at the back of the room, far from the stage where the high-ranking officers stood, waiting for her name to be called. She felt invisible to most of them. She could see their eyes scanning the crowd, pausing briefly on her, then moving on quickly. A few muttered among themselves, whispering about the young soldier who hadn't earned her place at this table. She couldn't help but feel like an imposter, not because of her actions, but because of how others perceived her. Emily had only been in the service for a few years, just barely out of her 20s. She had entered the military with a different kind of purpose, not for medals or recognition, but to make a difference. Yet somehow, the higher-ups saw her age as a flaw, not a strength. How could a young woman possibly be worthy of the same honors as those who had served for decades? And yet, she wasn't here by accident. Emily Harper was about to be awarded the highest medal for valor, a medal that would define her career and her life. But no one knew the truth about why she was here. Not the soldiers whispering in the corners, not the officers who judged her silently, not the veterans who saw her and fought. She's just a kid. But soon, they would all learn. The truth was hidden in plain sight, a story no one had bothered to ask her about, a story she had kept silent for years, a story that would change their perception in an instant. As the ceremony unfolded, the air in the room became heavy with tension. A few names were called for the typical recognitions, soldiers who had served diligently, but whose stories had already been told, whose sacrifices had already been catalogued and commemorated. The crowd nodded, clapped, moved on. But as the master of ceremonies called Sergeant Emily Harper's name, the whispers grew louder. "Emily Harper?" someone questioned. "Why is she being called up? She's barely been in the service." They didn't know. They couldn't know. How could they? Emily had worked in silence, on missions so covert, so risky, that no one had ever been able to document them. She had been placed in situations no one ever expected her to survive, situations where her every move was crucial and her every decision mattered. And now, here she stood, about to be recognized for something she had done, something that had saved lives and changed the course of a dangerous operation. The murmurs and whispers continued as Emily walked down the aisle toward the stage. She kept her eyes forward, though a small, inward smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She wasn't here for the approval of the crowd. She was here because she had done what others couldn't. And now, it was her time to be seen. But as the crowd shifted uneasily, there was something more, something unspoken. They weren't just questioning why she was there. They were about to realize how little they actually knew. What was about to unfold in that room would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about her. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, looking down at the papers before him. "For exceptional bravery under fire, for completing a mission against all odds, for saving the lives of civilians and military personnel alike, it is my honor to present the Medal of Valor to Sergeant Emily Harper." There was a beat of stunned silence, followed by a reluctant round of applause. But it wasn't applause for her, not yet. It was a polite acknowledgement, a courtesy more than anything. The crowd wasn't sure what to make of this young soldier. They couldn't reconcile the idea of someone so young, so new, deserving such a high honor. They had expected another name, another face, someone with years of service, someone who had earned the title in the old-fashioned way. But not Emily Harper, not the girl with the quiet demeanor and the youthful face. The applause faltered for a moment, then grew uncertain as Emily took her place at the podium. The tension in the room thickened, as though the air itself had become heavier. The general stepped forward, his eyes scanning the audience briefly before he turned his attention to Emily. He handed her the medal, and for the first time, Emily looked up. Her eyes met the crowd, but not with pride or arrogance. There was no need for that. Instead, she stood quietly, shoulders straight, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. She had done her job, and now it was time to let them see what they had missed. She stood still for a moment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, before the general began speaking again. Sergeant Harper's actions on the field of battle have saved countless lives, he said, his voice carrying with the gravity of the situation. When her unit was ambushed, when every officer was down, Sergeant Harper didn't run. She fought back. She saved civilians under fire. And when the operation seemed lost, she turned the tide and completed her mission alone. The room fell silent. The murmurs stopped. The whispers died down as the weight of her actions hit the crowd like a ton of bricks. They had all assumed her youth was a weakness. They had assumed she wasn't worthy of recognition. But here she was, standing before them, having done something they never thought possible. And just like that, the room shifted. The whispers stopped. The judgment faded. What they thought they knew about her was about to crumble. The crowd sat in stunned silence, their gazes fixed on Sergeant Emily Harper. It was as if the room had collectively held its breath. She stood at the center of the stage, receiving a medal for an act of bravery that no one in the room had truly understood until this moment. What had been whispered in disbelief only moments before was now turning into something else, something quieter, heavier, and harder to ignore. The general stood by her side, a solemn expression on his face as he turned to the crowd. His voice cut through the silence. "Sergeant Emily Harper is not just a soldier," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "She is the embodiment of the kind of heroism we all aspire to." The words lingered in the air, hanging like an unanswered question. They weren't expecting this. Some had hoped to dismiss her presence with a casual comment, an easy dismissal. "She doesn't belong here. Too young, too new." But they couldn't. Not anymore. Not with the weight of the general's words now sinking in. As the applause grew louder, it wasn't forced anymore. It wasn't polite acknowledgement of the ceremony. It was genuine. Something had shifted in the air, and the room, filled with so many skeptical eyes, was finally beginning to see the truth. They hadn't believed in her at first, but they were starting to. But the most remarkable thing about Emily, the thing that set her apart from the others, was that she didn't stand taller or puff out her chest. She simply stood still, head held high, her eyes fixed ahead. She wasn't looking for their approval. It was something they could never understand, even if they wanted to. The general cleared his throat again, signaling for the audience to settle. Sergeant Harper's actions in the field weren't about seeking recognition, he continued. They were about survival. About the lives she saved when the rest of the world had forgotten about them. The whispers started again, but this time, they weren't filled with doubt. They were filled with curiosity. "What did she do?" someone asked. "How did she pull it off?" Another muttered, still trying to piece together the mystery that was Sergeant Emily Harper. The older officers exchanged glances. This was a young woman who had accomplished something they hadn't. Something they might never have done, even if they had been given the same opportunities. There was no denying it. Emily Harper had earned this moment, and the audience was finally starting to grasp that. A few of the veterans in the crowd exchanged looks, as though they were remembering something they hadn't considered until now. They could see it now, the same fire in her eyes that had driven them when they had been young. The courage, the determination. It wasn't just about the medal. It was about the weight she carried in silence, the things she had done that no one would ever know, because she hadn't done them for the recognition. She had done them because they needed to be done. Emily didn't smile. She didn't reach out to take the spotlight. She simply stood at attention, her hands by her sides, allowing the moment to pass by her without ever claiming it as her own. She wasn't there for applause. She was there because that's what soldiers do. They serve. They fight. They sacrifice. And Emily Harper had done all of those things. She had lived her duty, and in her heart, she knew that her greatest achievement wasn't the medal she held in her hand. It was the lives she had saved, the mission she had completed when all hope seemed lost. The crowd continued to watch her. But now, the questions were different. What does she know that we don't? How did she survive when others didn't? There was an unspoken realization beginning to form in the room, one that spoke of humility and strength. The younger soldiers who had once whispered about her, questioning why she was there, began to look at her with a new kind of respect. The older officers, who had once doubted her abilities, now saw something else in her. It was a reflection of their own younger selves, a reminder of what it meant to serve in ways that mattered. The general's voice broke through the thoughts of the crowd. We rarely get the chance to truly understand the depths of those we serve beside. But today, you all have witnessed a hero. Sergeant Emily Harper's actions are a testament to the true meaning of valor. As the applause grew louder, Emily felt something shift inside her. It wasn't pride, not really. It wasn't a sense of victory, either. It was quiet recognition, the kind that only comes when your heart knows you've done what you set out to do, and the world just happens to see it. She wasn't interested in validation. She had never been. But for the first time, she could hear the respect in the room. It was real now. No more whispers. Just the truth that had finally found its way to the surface. As she made her way back to her seat, the eyes that followed her were different now. They were no longer skeptical or dismissive. They were filled with respect. The room had changed. They had seen something they couldn't ignore anymore. And for Emily, that was enough. The rest didn't matter. The applause echoed in Emily's ears as she made her way back to her seat, the heavy weight of the medal still resting on her chest. She was aware of the eyes following her. The whispers that had once held skepticism now turned to something different. Admiration, perhaps even respect. But the truth was, she didn't need to hear them. Emily had never been one to seek praise, not when it was so often given for the wrong reasons. The medal she wore wasn't about recognition. It was about the lives she had saved, the choices she had made in moments of pure chaos, and the reality that she had carried the burden of those decisions alone. Now, the world would finally see. As the ceremony continued, Emily's mind wandered, replaying the moment over and over in her head. The way the crowd had reacted when her name was called, the initial shock, the disbelief, it was all too familiar. She had always been an outlier, never quite fitting the mold that the military had created. Young, unassuming, and yet capable of things that others couldn't even begin to comprehend. Her mind drifted back to the moment she had been thrust into that hellish operation, the one that had earned her the medal. She had been dropped behind enemy lines with no backup, no resources, just a team of civilians who needed her to keep them alive. She thought about the bullet that grazed her shoulder, about the burning pain that shot through her arm when she took down the enemy snipers one by one. She had moved through the smoke and chaos with one thought in mind: survival. Not for her own sake, but for the civilians who were counting on her, for the soldiers she had left behind, who would be left with nothing if she didn't get the job done. It hadn't been heroic. It had been simple. Do what you have to get through it. But it had been enough. And that was why she was here now, why the medal was in her hands. As Emily settled back into her seat, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The older veterans who had once whispered behind her back, wondering how someone like her could even be here, were now looking at her with a different kind of recognition. Some exchanged glances, their eyes flickering between her and the general, who was still standing by the podium. They didn't know her story, but they would. It was impossible not to. They'd heard the words: exceptional bravery under fire, saved lives, completed the mission alone. It was the kind of mission that broke soldiers, and Emily had been given the impossible task of carrying it through. But no one truly knew what it took to get to that moment. No one could understand the toll it had taken on her, the months of training, the countless sleepless nights she had spent preparing herself for a mission she never thought would come. The weight of the responsibilities she carried had been far heavier than any physical burden. The hardest part had been the isolation, the knowledge that, in the end, she would be alone. And that's exactly what happened when her team was ambushed. The chaos had been brutal, but she'd kept moving, kept fighting, kept pushing forward with the knowledge that there was no choice but to succeed. She had done what she had to do to survive, Her mind snapped back to the present when the general's voice boomed over the speaker, catching everyone's attention again. He was recounting the details of her mission, a story that only a handful of people knew. The most crucial parts of it, anyway. What the general didn't mention was how Emily had defied orders, how she'd made the decision to push forward without waiting for backup, knowing the risks. Or how, when she had finally made contact with command, they had told her to fall back. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had stayed because she knew there were people out there who were depending on her to finish the job. She had done what was necessary, not because she wanted a medal, not because she needed validation, but because in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the mission. As the general finished recounting the events, he turned to Emily and nodded, the respect clear in his eyes. He knew what they were all beginning to realize, that she was not just another soldier, another recruit who had stumbled into something bigger than herself. She had earned her place here, and the medal she wore was a symbol of her strength, her resolve, and her unshakable will to do what needed to be done. The applause grew louder, but Emily remained standing still, her gaze straight ahead. She wasn't looking for praise, but for the first time in her life, she could feel it. The respect was real now, and though she had always kept herself distant from the need for validation, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride well up inside her. She had done it, and the world had finally seen her for what she truly was. Not just a soldier, but a survivor, a hero in her own right. But even as the applause rang out, Emily's mind was already moving forward. This moment was just a blip in time, a fleeting acknowledgement that would fade as quickly as it had come. She was already thinking about the next mission, the next challenge, the next life to be saved. That was what mattered to her. Not the medals, not the recognition. The people she served, the ones she protected, the ones who had trusted her with their lives. They were the real reason she kept going, and they were the ones who would carry her memory when she was no longer standing at the front. The truth about Emily Harper wasn't just that she had earned a medal, but that she had earned something far more valuable, the respect of her peers. And that was something that no one, not even the harshest critics in the room, could take away from her. The whispers had stopped, and now there was nothing left but the silence that followed the recognition of her strength, her courage, and her unrelenting determination to serve, no matter the cost. As the ceremony drew to a close, Emily stood there, taking it all in. She wasn't the young girl they had once whispered about. She was something else now, something stronger, something unbreakable. The room had finally learned the truth.